This is my first book, yeah.
It's going to be an amazing book. Every time I'm reading it, I'm like, oh, wow, this is so cool.
Oh, it's really, I didn't know there is so much to his story. I mean, not just his teachings, the story is so fabulous. Multi-layered story, so many different characters. I mean, I'm just enjoying the entire process. I mean, before this, I didn't know anything about Jesus. I mean, it's like I come from India, totally different culture. I've been to the churches, but never inquired, about Jesus. But then to look at his life scripturally, how it's documented, how people understand it, it's just amazing, and so many differing opinions. That's what makes it fascinating. I mean, there are some people who go to the extremes of saying that such a man didn't even exist. It was all a creation of Jews, because their temple was destroyed and they wanted a new hope, and here was this mythical character with all these qualities. But then, I mean, my argument in the book is completely different. I mean, if there was anybody who was real, he was real. I mean, there's no doubt, there's no question about it. I mean, even historically, if you study the consistency of the message, his life, his story, the place, the backdrop, the characters, if you want to create a mythical story like that, then it's even better than reality. I mean, how historically his life, how it fits in properly, I mean, we know right from the date, 4th century BC when he was born, so many different things. But of course, there are other stories which are not a part of that reality, which is a part of the religion. And our individual motives and desires to look at his life in a certain way has made him a totally different character. But then, yeah, I mean, extraordinary life and so many things that are completely submerged, hidden from the general public because of, certain ideological differences and simple things. For example, his family life. Nobody knows, because all his human elements, I mean, if we accept that he was a human being and he lived and died, then there's got to be that story as well. But somehow Bible doesn't tell that story, because the purpose of the Bible is very different, of course. We want to see him only as divine. So all the human qualities, human frailties, that has changed his narrative a lot. What happened on the cross, the words that he used, what he spoke about, it's all been toned down so that, his story is just fabulous. In fact, to even see, a lot of it is so painful that people didn't even want to record it. For example, if you think about it, for the first 400 years after the death of Christ, there was no symbolism of the cross. The symbolism of the cross came only after 400 years, after Romans officially stopped the practice of crucifixion. And for almost 100 years, crucifixion was completely stopped, and then the symbolism of the cross came in. So the question is, what were they worshipping for the first 300, 400 years? Because Roman Catholic Christianity comes 300 years after Jesus. So the first Gospels, the compilation of the Gospels, everything is almost 300 years later. So the early Christians, the first 300 years, that's the most important period of Christianity, where they were practicing spirituality, meditation, different schools of Christianity, different thoughts, different ideas, and how they interpreted his life. There is rich scriptures and texts, everything is available. But since one particular scripture was made popular through an organizing effort, I mean, Romans were good at organizing things. I mean, even now we're looking at that aspect, how well they were able to organize things. So this one particular scripture was organized, and almost till 1500s there were no other books. Bible, you could not print your own Bible, you could not give your own interpretation. It was all sanctioned by the church. It had to be written by the scribes of the church. So these other scriptures were completely lost. I mean, you must have heard about it. In 1945, they found these scriptures in the cave in Egypt. Now they call it the Nag Hammadi Library. I mean, those scriptures opened up his life to a completely different interpretation. Because there was Gospel of Mary Magdalene, there's Gospel of Judas, there's Gospel of Thomas. These were his disciples, closest disciples. So his actual words, the actual conversations between the disciples, the conflict between them, it's just amazing.
One thing he found that really fascinated me was, Peter, and they say he was the rock and upon this church, I will build my church. Well, his interpretation of the rock was he was so hard-headed that he wouldn't listen to anything.
Yeah, if Jesus
And we've
can,
interpreted it as he's a rock foundation, but really Jesus was saying, you're thick as a rock. You don't learn.
because
you
he
know,
was
you don't understand
against
anything.
women, he was very narrow-minded, which is all there in the scriptures. I mean, if Jesus can walk on water, Peter sinks like a rock. I mean, that itself says, in a spiritual world, a rock is not a good example. It's like, you're like too hard-headed. You're not understanding what's happening. See, this is where, book's going to be very controversial in that sense. People will have their own interpretations. Oh, Saint Peter, how can you talk about Saint Peter like this? I mean, I'm not talking about Saint Peter. I'm talking about the character, the person, the individual. And it's not my interpretation. It's all there in the scriptures. And it's all there in the Gospels. Their conversation is recorded. It's just that it was not a part of the mainstream knowledge, but it has always been there.